A maze of lanes link the houses that are scattered sparsely about these fields, and the lanes wander into one another like streams until they reach some main road. These narrow lanes are still in use. In places, the hedges that grow on the high banks along the lanes are so wild that the trees join and tangle above them to form a roof. And in the full leaf of summer, it is like walking through a green tunnel pierced by vivid pinpoints of light. I came back to live among these lanes 30 years ago. My wife and I were beginning our life together, and we thought we could make a bare living on these small fields, and I would write. It was a time when we could have settled almost anywhere, and if she had not liked the place and the people, we would have moved elsewhere. I too liked the place, but I was from these fields, and my preference was less important.
Well, John McGahern was a man, I suppose, we took for granted a good deal when he was alive, and when he was dead, of course, we're all honouring him. But he'd see him around the town here, the same as you would in Mohill, and I think he tended to go to Mohill more than Ballinamore. But he'd be here often enough. You'd see him up at Pat Mack's garage or in different places. And he was regarded very much as an ordinary person, because he was very easy to talk to, and he wouldn't be talking about books or literature. Now, you could ask him about them, all right, but he wouldn't dwell on it very much. And it was only when something would come up like a new book or a programme on radio or television, and we said, Christ, that man's living here, so.
John was at ease, as I said, with farming and country people and country ways and country sayings, and it wasn't just that he put it on to be a part of it. He was naturally at home with his cattle and on his land, and that's where he drew his strength from and his great stories from. I remember being in his company one night, and we talked about his second last book rather, That They May Face the Rising Sun. And somebody in the story was explaining to Rutledge about John Quinn's first night with his new woman. And the way he described him having a good time was, he described it as in and out all night of a most happy future. And even John would tell that so many times, he would still throw back his head and laugh at the idea of it. Now, that's probably a line he picked up and made his own of it someplace. But he enjoyed it, and to the day he died, even though, as I said, he wrote it, read it, heard it read, and whatever, he still enjoyed it to that extent. And when he was in the company of people, let it be in Callahan's in Mohill or Luke Early's or a pub in Ballinamore or wherever he was, he enjoyed their company for their little ways of telling things, and that was his gift, that he could remember them and make his own of it.
What is a masterpiece, Sean? And he says, a masterpiece is the correct distribution of ink on the correct number of white pages.
Tonight we're coming to you from Carrick-on-Shannon in County Leitrim, the home of writer John McGahern, who died last year. The occasion of the inaugural John McGahern International Seminar, a joint initiative of NUI Galway's English Department and Leitrim County Council. John McGahern was born here in South Leitrim, and the landscape and the people of this place permeates his stories, novels and memoirs.
Very touched and honoured to have been asked to give this talk in memory of my beloved teacher and friend. Whenever Keith Richards gets up to perform as lead guitarist with the Rolling Stones, he always says, first of all, it's great to be here. And then he adds, as a cautious afterthought, come to think of it, it's great to be anywhere. And John had a rather similar line whenever he sat down to a meal with us. He used to, if we began complaining about things like the rain, or the spitefulness of neighbours, or the treachery of old friends, he would look and say, oh yeah, all that's true, but on the other hand, isn't it amazing that we're here at all? Whenever a major author in Ireland dies, one of two things happens. Either the reputation drops when they're no longer around to promote it, and that has happened sadly to some very good people, or else, and John said this about one or two of his friends, including a poet from a nearby county, or else, he says, it rises immeasurably because they're no longer around to damage it. He's been gone now for over a year, His resting place in Auchawillan with his beloved mother has become, I am told, a place of pilgrimage. It seems to be a cross between a West of Ireland Pattern Day and the kind of devotions offered at the grave of Jim Morrison in Père Lachaise in Paris. I think that John would have had something wry, sardonic and even self-effacing to say about all that, because he was a truly humble man. Doubtless many of the pilgrims are praying for the peaceful repose of his soul in ways that the author of the country funeral could only honour and respect. And I'm sure many also are coming to honour an honest craftsman, someone whose work was always done to the highest standard in the best tradition of rural Irish carpentry, bricklaying and general crafts.
The first book of John's I heard of was The Barracks, and it was actually my Aunt Maura who had it in the house, because I was of course a pupil of John's at Belgrove School in Clontarf, as were my cousins the Dolans, and my Aunt Maura actually read his book. She was a great reader of contemporary Irish novels, and I suddenly realised that this man who was teaching us had a whole different secret life, and I was beginning to be a reader myself, so that was fascinating. And then the controversial circumstances in which he left a few years later added a whiff of glamour and also of the forbidden to all that. I think the other book I was very aware of, and this would have been just after my student years in Trinity, round about the early to mid 1970s, was The Leave Taking. And that was almost narcissistic, I have to admit, because the first half of that book is set in my old primary school. It's all about John's dismissal from Belgrove, and there are fabulous descriptions, very minute and exact, not just of the mannerisms of our old headmaster, Mr. Gallagher, but of what the playground was like, especially when the seagulls from Dublin Bay wheeled over it, looking for stray crusts after the boys had finished their lunches. There's a wonderful description of a local sweet shop we all went to after school, which was called the Bon Bon. It was run by a woman called Miss Hayden, and it was over the fridge in that shop that Mr. Gallagher had first offered John the job, and then had to break to him years later the awful news that the job was no longer his.
The Archbishop John Charles McQuaid used his influence to ensure that McGahern was removed from his teaching position. Not only had he written what McGahern would refer to humorously later as a dirty book, but he had also had the temerity to get married in a registry office to a Finnish woman, Annikki Latsi. And that made his position completely untenable. Brought up in the Catholic faith by a pious, devout mother, and a father whom he described as very outwardly religious, McGahern couldn't have avoided the presence of religion in his life. His memory was saturated with religious truths and rituals, as he wrote in the essay, The Church and the Spire, which was published in 1993. And I quote from it, "All this was learned at home. The lamp that burned day and night before the Sacred Heart on the high mantelpiece. The silence that fell when the Angelus rang. The story of Christ as a story that gave meaning to our lives through the great feasts of Christmas and Easter and Whitsun."
The father is probably the first love of a girl and the mother of a boy. Is that because there were so many children who came so quickly, there was 4 of us in 3 years, I think, is that she used to take me before I was a school-going age to school with her, and we used to walk alone to school, and often walking in similar places over the years, I got this very strange feeling of peace and happiness, and almost a feeling that you could live forever, of extraordinary well-being. And eventually I traced it back to those walks to Lissycarn School with my mother, where she'd name the wildflowers, and sometimes we'd pick the flowers for the jam jars in the school.
This is Auchawillan National School, which was built in 1933, the year before John McGahern was born. John went to school here for about 3 years of his life, from about the age of 7 to about the age of 10. His mother was teaching here in this school, and this is the last school that his mother taught in. She died while she was a permanent member of the staff here. After the mother died, John left Aughwillan and went to live in the barracks in Guthall. But John writes in his memoir quite a lot about coming from his house in Curramahan, coming up this lane here behind us, and coming to school here, and also going to Mass in Aughwillan Church, which is just up the road from here.
I'm from Ballahadreen in County Roscommon. He came originally from near French Park, and he was from Croot Hall. And that wasn't very far away from where I was from. And the idea of a book being written about a place so close to home fascinated me for a start. And then the book itself absolutely gripped me because of the topic and the sadness of it and the bleakness of it, which you could relate to at that time, late 60s, early 70s, northwest Roscommon. It just echoed so accurately the reality of life there. The story itself was a very sad story, the story of the death of his mother, which we know now to be true. But at the time, it wasn't as clear he was writing about his mother.
The window of the sick room opened and the nurse motioned to me to come to the room. It could not be put off any longer. Inside the house looked much larger, emptied of all the furniture. In a terrible numbness I climbed the stairs, crossing the landing by the open doors of the small empty bedrooms, entered the room and went towards the bed. Maggie and the nurse were in the room. "The lorry'll be going soon, mammy." "Not for a little time yet, love." Her voice was so low I was hardly able to hear. "I came to say goodbye, mammy." Her eyes were fixed on my face. She seemed to be very tired. I bent to kiss her. She did not move. I was bewildered. But Maggie and the nurse turned away. I tried to hurry. If I did not get away quickly, I'd never be able to walk out of the room. I wanted to put my arms around the leg of the bed so that they wouldn't be able to drag me away and they'd be forced to leave me with her in the room forever. I went out the door, crossed the landing, went down the stairs and out into the blinding day.
Listen, the man's reputation is only beginning to grow. It had begun to grow with amongst women in 1990 at home. He was acclaimed in the latter years, the latter 2 decades approximately of his life, sealed really by memoir, a beautiful piece of work which seemed to confirm that there was a strong autobiographical flavour to everything he wrote. And he's a huge following in France, particularly. I think his reputation will grow as time goes on, as it'll become another academic industry, as we have with other Irish writers. Whether he'll ever be as big as James Joyce is another matter entirely, I don't know. But I really don't care. He's a different type of writer entirely, who would have, I'd say, a much broader public appeal than a purely academic appeal, which is the case with a lot of Joycean scholarship.
In 1993, the barracks was placed on the syllabus for the Agrégation en CAPES, the competitive exam which is held each year to recruit secondary school English teachers in France. It meant that all English departments all over the country had to organize courses on McGahern that year. It was also a great opportunity for those same departments to invite McGahern to give conferences. And that year, he went on a veritable tour de France, which I hope he went without taking any drugs. It was a great occasion for me to meet him, to hear him talk, and even to ask him a few questions. We noticed very quickly that he had a very special way of avoiding making straight answers to the students' questions, usually replying with a joke or a quip, and always suggesting that his job was merely to write the stories and that it was our job to explain what he had meant or how he had managed to mean anything. I was lucky to be given some time to have a conversation with him, and I soon discovered that behind the facade of the countryman he liked to offer to the world, as when he would talk of his farm and his cows, etc., there was an extremely refined and cultivated man of letters. For example, as I reminded him of his meeting my father-in-law at Colgate University, he casually mentioned his friendship with American writer Raymond Carver and the correspondence he had with him after that. He had met him while going duck shooting with him during one of his stays in America. After the talk that he gave that day, a colleague of mine and myself drove McGahern back to the station, and I still keep an image of him walking away, the very picture of the Irish countryman wearing a large, indefinite raincoat and carrying a plastic carrier bag in his hand.
There was an evening of Irish artists, writers and so on in Paris, and John was there, and there were very few Irish people living in Paris at the time, and we decided, as we would do, as Irish people do when they're abroad, go up to him after the little presentation, and we had a most remarkable conversation with him, and in fact I think not alone did it lead me to try to explore John McGahern a little bit more, but it actually took me ultimately to live in Leitrim. The journey from France took me through Belgium and Dublin, and then ultimately to Leitrim.
And it's in the churchyard and the graveyard of Ardcarn Church that John's father is buried, and his stepmother. So we have the burial place of his father behind us. We have a place where he.
Boyle River is about 17 miles long. The midpoint of it is Lough Key. It rises in Lough Gara in South County Sligo, close to the villages of Monastraden and Gurchin. As the Boyle River comes into Lough Key and then leaves Lough Key, for people like ourselves who are interested in John McGahern, we're reaching sort of the holy ground, really. In John's novels, we could read about places, or we could pretend to ourselves or presume to ourselves that we knew places, or we could pick out places or maybe even people within the lines of his works. But it wasn't really until Memoir was published that he gave us sort of clear, reliable information on how important some places and some people were to him. The best times were the days he took me on the river in the tarred boat. I'd hold the lines while he rowed. In the silence I'd hear my sister's cries from the barracks, now uninhibited in their play. I can hear a pipe on his motorbike coming up from Moran's Bay, he would say when he was in good humour. Often the river seemed to liberate him from himself, but those moments were fragile. Tangled lines or a sudden slip of the tongue could cause the whole day to unravel. But fraught as they sometimes were, those outings were my introduction to the river, which became in the years ahead both an escape and a blessed need.
He lived in the barracks, which was 20 miles away in Coot Hall. We were afraid of him, and I think, I remember once trouble because he used a knife to take some childish scabs off my face.
On the day before the leaving cert, he wanted to get away and escape. So where did he go to but the river? And he writes, the day before the exam was an intensification of the same. A Sunday, hot and without a breeze. With Joan, I went on the river in the old tarred boat, the tar melting and smelling in the heat, and I had to pour water over the squealing roan pins. She let out the spoons, and I rowed at slow trawling speed.
The summer of 1987, I was waiting for my Leaving Cert results when my brother handed me a copy of a book I hadn't seen before by an author I'd never heard of. Young Mahony's troubles in the dark somehow made my own anxiety far less, and it began a fascination with McGahern which continued into college when I got an opportunity to see John McGahern read in my first year. For John McGahern, all that mattered ultimately was the writer alone in a room and the reader alone with a book. The solitary reader was the person who brought the books alive again. As Eamon Maher said last night, using a phrase from Joyce, the book is a coffin of words until it's opened up by the reader. That was all that mattered to John McGahern, creating the world of his imagination and giving other people the opportunity to bring that world back to life in a different way through their own personal vision, through their own lives.
I wrote him a letter to ask, and I remember very craftily, I was living in Dublin at the time, but I put my Longford address on the letter because I thought I might stand more of a chance of actually getting an interview with him. And I wrote him a letter saying, you know, why I wanted to interview him, and that stressing that I didn't want to talk about his life, I wanted to talk about his work. And I think he wrote back to me very briefly and said that he would be happy to talk to me and would I give him a call. So I called him. I remember calling him from Trinity, and I was so nervous that instead of asking him if he'd be, I meant to say, would you be interested in an interview? I accidentally said, would you be interesting in an interview? And cue mortification. But he was, he laughed, and we made an arrangement, met in the Longford Arms Hotel 2 days later. We took tea in a room upstairs, and he was so mischievous. He was looking over my shoulder the whole time at a couple behind us who were having a row, and he was just getting great pleasure out of this, not out of the row, but out of the, basically it was gossip and it was a story, and I could see his eyes working on that story as we were talking, and you felt that, like when you were talking to him, that he was seeing right into you and he knew everything about you. His fiction, I suppose, had trained me for that. Despite all of that, it was a really pleasant experience, and we stayed in touch and then became friends, and that was very special to me.
I was fascinated with the idea of the leave-taking being rewritten in the light of the French translation. So I read it, and I read the translations, and then I read the leave-taking amongst women, and then I got very, very interested in both the writer and the man. And I suppose he spoke to me in a way that he speaks to a lot of his readers, that I saw a lot of my own native North Tipperary in the landscape and in the characters. I saw a lot of my father's generation in the characters as well. So there was an automatic sort of fusion of interests, and that's the roundabout way I came to his writing.
Leitrim and the Northwest form a unique and important backdrop to the McGahern canon. We in NUI Galway share in this geography, and by becoming the home for the papers of John McGahern, we in a very real way maintain for this region an enduring link with the writer and the man.
These last 3 days have been marvellous in that we've had these eminent academics down here and pointing out some of the sort of finer points in his work that I probably wouldn't have noticed prior to hearing them, and that certainly added a lot of depth to it.
I did graduate study and I've been to lots of conferences, and this was a very different atmosphere. Everyone was there because they wanted to be there. They were all readers of the work, and I think, I'm sure this event will just become massive in the years to come, but I'll always remember the first one as a very, very special weekend.
I've been reading the man since I was 20, having grown up in the area. Delighted, firstly, that he had a successful author, and more delighted that he was taking on the establishment. And then suddenly to find in my latter years that I got to know the man, and all of those things have come together here this weekend, and I'm sure it's the start of many to go from here forward.